us at Thomson Reuters Talks Financial Crime. I am your host, Gina Jurva, attorney and manager of market insights and thought leadership at the Thomson Reuters Institute. In today's episode, we are going to talk about the importance of adverse media screening. Now, adverse media screening is one of the most effective safeguards financial institutions have against criminal efforts to launder money by funneling it through legitimate banking systems. And because it is so useful, financial regulatory authorities around the world have made screening for negative media an essential legal requirement for know your customer onboarding protocols, continued customer due diligence, and enhanced due diligence on potentially high-risk customers. Well, joining me today is Gabe Hidalgo of K2 Integrity. Gabe is a managing director at K2 Integrity. Gabe, it is a pleasure to have you on the show with me today.
Thanks, Gina.
So let's just start with what adverse media screening really means for financial institutions. Can you just give us some context around this topic?
Sure. So adverse media screening, or in the parlance of most compliance officers, negative news screening, is basically a search that's conducted by financial institutions as part of their due diligence process in order to uncover potentially negative information that may impact the applicant or customer that the financial institution is looking to either onboard or has already onboarded onto their platform. The negative news could consist of indications of the underlying applicant or client being involved in money laundering, fraud, corruption, sanctions exposure, terrorism, or any type of threat financing. Now, the information is typically gathered from sources such as open source information that's available online on the internet, and it generally includes reputable sources, news reports, but financial institutions are expected to cast a wider net. They are expected to search law enforcement bulletins. They're expected to search government bulletins, anything from tax authorities or other agencies that may be providing information as well. So it's always important to cast as wide a net when conducting adverse media reviews so that you have as best a picture of the underlying applicant or client.
Right, and that's really why it's so important. Like, I mean, as you were saying, it's like we're trying to find out, is this customer or potential customer, are they involved in some sort of nefarious activity, criminal or otherwise, that would, make them not a good fit for the bank? And so, is this, just to be clear, is this a regulatory requirement in the United States, or is it part of ongoing due diligence?
So as part of the ongoing due diligence, as part of the onboarding due diligence that's expected for every financial institution, adverse media searches have become a regulatory expectation. In fact, I have personally been a regulator. I worked for the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and my expectation would always be that as part of a due diligence review, that there be negative news, adverse media reviews in those files. Now, as part of the regulatory expectation and the regulatory requirement that due diligence be conducted, an adverse media search is basically part and parcel of the toolkit that compliance officers have in painting a picture of what the applicant or client has been involved in previously before arriving at the financial institution. And when I say financial institution, I don't mean just banks, because there are other types of financial institutions that maintain accounts and are onboarding customers on their platforms. They also have a duty to conduct this type of review as part of their due diligence. But again, that's part of the toolkit that a compliance professional has, is to conduct these types of reviews to build a fulsome profile on the applicant or the client for purposes of due diligence.
And I think, the other piece, though, is that there's a lot of news out there. And so when you're advising financial institutions of any sort, what advice are you giving them on how to really set up a good adverse media or negative news screening program?
I think that the adverse media negative news screening program should be tailored to the institution as well as to the data that the institution has. There's a lot of good quality third-party vendors out there that have proprietary data, what we would call data sources, where you're able to go in, type in search terms that you've created for the adverse media review that will ultimately provide you with a good source of material for your adverse media reviews. Additionally, outside of those third-party vendors, a lot of financial institutions also rely on open source reviews, and they've created templated language by which you can insert the subject's name, in this case, the subject being the applicant or the customer, so that you don't have to recreate the wheel every time. In addition to that, we also advise our clients to also set standards and criteria for those adverse news reviews, adverse media reviews, in order to ensure yourself that the material that you're looking at is relevant to what the risk profile is at your bank, as well as it's, the recency is there. So something that occurred 20 or 30 years ago may not be as relevant as something that occurred 5 years ago or 7 years ago. But those standards should be included within your adverse media program so that whoever's conducting the review knows what types of guidelines are provided and can use those guidelines to create, in reality, a good adverse media review for each and every applicant or client that the financial institution needs to review.
Right. And I think what you said there too is that, if something is 20 years old that comes up on a media search might not be as relevant as something that was 5 years old or 2 years old. And so how do you really ensure, and I think you really address this, but how do you ensure that you're not getting a bunch of false positives or just useless noise when it comes to news?
So for financial institutions, when they're conducting the adverse media reviews, the negative news reviews, part of the review should focus on the materiality of the underlying news or the underlying information. An allegation that someone has, for example, cheated on their spouse is probably not going to be material to the products and services that the financial institution is looking to offer that applicant or that client. However, if there are allegations in regards to possible embezzlement or official corruption proceeds being directed towards this applicant or your current customer, that would have a more material weight to the way that your adverse news media portfolio and your dossier on your client or your applicant is going to affect whether or not they receive products and services from your financial institution. The bottom line is that every financial institution should set up their own criteria, should set up guidelines, both in timeliness of the information as well as materiality, in order to ensure that the underlying investigators are not wasting their time with information that really has no bearing on whether or not the financial institution should extend their products and services to this client or applicant.
Absolutely. And I think, we're going to talk in episodes coming up with some of our journalists at Reuters, where we're going to talk about some case studies where financial institutions may have ignored some very important adverse media screening alerts and how it's gone awry. So it can go awry. Really important to follow a good protocol, as you've said. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit here and chat with me about adverse media screening. It's so important, especially right now with so much news coming at us. So Gabe Hidalgo, K2 Integrity, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Gina. Always a pleasure.